Patrick and Chris, and we are talking African languages and how we can introduce African languages or use our African languages in our daily lives, in our education system, and sort of like stop using English as it's called in international languages, but also trying to use our African languages in our education system. But now the question is, how do you fully introduce African languages within academia, whereby you get somebody that graduates with a PhD but did his PhD in Zulu, purely in Zulu?
Mm-hmm.
That's the burning question. So I don't know what's your take on that, Chris.
Yeah. So definitely, just because the person, you can definitely write in your home language, because we know that you can express yourself oftentimes more easily in your home language. So if we develop these languages such as Zulu, and we are able to write our theses in this language, I mean, definitely there is a space for that. How many journals in South Africa are bilingual, where the thesis is written in 2 languages? There are many of them.
Okay, and another question is, there's colonial and material condition barriers that are in place. But question is, have we identified these barriers that have been sort of hindering African languages into academia or into the education system or into society and business as a whole, as Patrick was saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think what you mentioned earlier about decolonization as well, you bring up a very important point when you mention decolonization. And this is, we don't have answers to all of this now, but like you're saying, it's burning questions. We need to ask them. We need to get
but I'm just asking. But now, obviously, in order for you to recognize that there's a problem,
yes,
you have to identify what's the cause of the problem, or what's the barrier in place that's stopping you from reaching your goal.
Yeah.
So I want to know, what are the barriers that are already in place in our society that are hindering African languages from getting into academia and our education system?
I think the way our whole society is set up, right? First of all, language. English is the language of business. English is the language of communication. English is the language of study.
But now, who says English is a language of business? Who says English is? Are we sort of like conditioned to say such things?
We have,
because you're making an affirmation or a confirmation that English is.
We are kind of having a tunnel view of how things have been, all right? And the problem is that we are saying language should be developed, but how should this be developed? And I want to go back to an earlier question that you asked. One of the things that will help is de-institutionalizing English. For example, newspapers. Is it possible to print newspapers in the local languages? I hear that in South Africa, one of the most read newspapers is one written in isiZulu. And if we can begin from that point, then it seems that that's a good starting point. But also in theater, right? In theater, can we begin to take our languages and use them as languages of performance? In writing, even simple stories for children that they can understand their mother tongue. Can we start to write these stories in mother tongue?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I hear the question, but now when it comes to certain sectors within academia, looking at accounting, do you think we can change accounting into any indigenous languages? I mean, what's a debit in Zulu? What's a credit in Zulu? Just to start.
Yeah. Well, listen to this. In Afrikaans, debit is debit and credit is credit. Okay, so it's not a big difference. So if we are able to communicate and use these languages, we'll be okay.
We'll be okay.
Yeah, but as also I said earlier on, language develops. It's wrong to assume that things are set in stone, and the fact that we don't have a word that says, for example, debit, or says some concept in mathematics doesn't mean that we cannot find one. Language is something that develops. We experts, people who can come up with words that can suitably represent those different words that exist in English or in any other language.
Yeah, because as you were saying, I agree with you that language is always developing, because every time you look at an Oxford dictionary, there's always new words within the Oxford Dictionary, and language develops. But now, when you look at our African languages, because we're not really focusing on them, there's not really so much development. Our African languages remain as informal language, whereby we can only talk that language amongst ourselves. But in places like institutions, we cannot. If you're not speaking in English, you're not heard.
And that's what you mentioned earlier. Can we identify these obstacles that stand in the way of development?
Yeah.
So we have policies that are in place, but are they really implemented? And that's, I think, what you're asking. How do we it's fair enough to have the law and the rule that mother tongue education should be available for everyone. That's the law. So now how do we actually enforce it, and how do we develop these languages and be able to learn in them? And I do think that if we set up commissions, and there are commissions, there are all kinds of things in place, we just have to push a little harder.
So my question is, do you think media can play an integral role in achieving this objective, whereby we're trying to institutionalize your African languages? Because, I mean, media as one of the things that touches like the masses and speaks to the masses, and most of the time messages are conveyed within colonial languages. Do you think media can play an integral role in this, and how?
Look, media is just one of the way, but I think the approach should be a composite one. Like I said earlier on, in theater, that could be one, media could be one, in schools could be one, even our parliamentarians. Why would they want to address their people in English? Why can they argue in their mother tongue, whatever it is, and so on and so on. So I think there are multiple places and spaces in which our languages can be developed.
But looking at the programming on television, do you think it can be changed? Because I feel like the programming on television is too westernized and not really African. Don't you think that African media should be putting African culture and tradition and languages first before playing westernized programming?
Well, I do think a lot of programs on, for example, DSTV, are in African languages. Many of them are African content made by Africans and South Africans. But I think the question then becomes availability and access. Who gets access to these things? Who gets access to these kinds of programs? People who pay a lot of money to get access to these things. Who are those people? People who have a lot of money to afford that kind of entertainment. So it becomes a question of access as well.
And the question is, us looking at Africanizing our institutions of academia, if we do that and happen to like decolonizing our universities comes to that level whereby even languages, but do we have study material and curriculums that are already ready in place within that are written in our indigenous languages? Because I always believe when something falls, something has to rise.
This is not a one-day project. I, for example, are of the opinion that the way this could begin, for example, is to start having, for example, a subject in one of the African languages. And slowly, you begin to produce, for example, the manpower that will probably write and teach in these languages. So it's not a one-day project. It's of a period of time that this development should take place.
And question is, do you feel like or believe that the African government or South African government, let me narrow it down to South African government, is playing their role in order for us to move in this direction? Or if not, how could they go about to do so?
Government, for example, in education already has policies in place that indigenous language should be taught at a certain level. So that's the first step. So if government begins to put laws and policies in place, I think that's a very good place to begin to encourage the movement of language, the development of African languages. But again, as I said, it cannot be entirely something that government exclusively does. the whole public can be involved, and as I've pointed out earlier on, for example, those in art and culture, in theater, once there's a test, when something begins to develop, say there's a production in one of the indigenous languages. In fact, we already have this. If you look at some of our popular soapies, most of them really are in local languages. So that's one way to begin. And I think this kind of program should be supported, either financially or even in law and policy.
Yeah.
So you mentioned something about policies and law. So I'd like to know, when these policies get released by government, are there texts of these policies in our indigenous languages, whereby these policies are translated? Because we often say that people are illiterate, but not that people are illiterate. People are literate, but most people are literate in their own languages. Just because a policy is written in English and I cannot read English, but I can read Zulu, it doesn't mean that I'm illiterate. So do these policies come in translated text?
Policies, I'm not sure. Do you think that there are the policies? I'm sure there would be.
I think this is one of the questions and one of the things that need to be researched, because I believe when a policy gets released, it should be also released in all indigenous languages of the country.
Because whenever Parliament introduces a new bill or whatever, it goes out onto SABC and so on. But that's the thing where interpreters and so on come into play. That's when we need them. So if you have a dedicated channel on TV where that's a Zulu channel, for example, and they introduce a new policy, we need people who translate who interpret that and give it to the masses, the people who don't necessarily speak.
I'd like to disagree with you on that. I'd like that the government, the people that are writing the policies, when they are writing the policies, they should, when they release a policy should be released in all indigenous languages.
Yes, that's what I'm
because
saying.
We've got 11
official
languages.
Yeah.
But when a policy gets released, it gets released in English. You can even check on the .org websites where policies are released.
Yeah.
They're all in English.
Yeah, and that's when we need to demand, because it is our constitutional right to receive these kinds of, or this kind of information in our own languages. It is our right. So that's why we need to demand. We need to demand to be heard in our own languages.
And looking at it's week 3 of African Insights, and I'd like to know, for a student that's part of African Insight listening at home, what should they expect in this week's African Insights, and what study texts should they look at?
There are a number of texts that they should read, which are on Blackboard. The first one, which I mentioned, was by Chinua Achebe, the African writer and English language, 1975. The other one is by Obunjwa Wali, The Dead End of African Literature. And the third one is
I think that one's Decolonizing the Mind.
Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. These are the 3 texts that you should read, and they speak about different aspects of Africanizing African languages. In fact, there is one thing that we haven't touched on. Is it possible also to Africanize English? Like the Nigerian
That's a brilliant question, because I also ask myself, how African is English? Is English really European? Is it really African? It's a brilliant question, because the history that we've been taught at school, there's a twist to it, because history is always written by the victor. And obviously the victor will always write the history in accordance with his agendas. You know what I mean?
Yeah, we
won't
need to
write
decolonize English. That's what we need to do.
For me, the best example, and I want to bring this to the attention of the listeners, is the way the Nigerians speak English. It's laced with their mother tongue. A whole collection. A whole collection of different native languages together with English.
Yeah.
And they have owned it up. Can we do something like that?
And I've heard of this word decolonization. You say we must decolonize English. But now, I believe that in order to achieve it, you have to be able to define it in a way. So, what's your definition of decolonization, or what's a decolonized South Africa to you?
Oh wow, okay, I thought you were going to ask what's a decolonized English. Which I think is also... Yeah, decolonize. I mean, that's the point of our course, African Insights. We are trying to introduce African ideas, and to look at Africa is not only a place we can learn about. I mean, we can learn about Africa in so many different ways. Its history, all aspects of it. But what can we learn from Africa? And that is, I think, what is decolonization. It's not only looking towards the West for all our ideas and all the things that we use. We have to look at our neighbors and at ourselves. What can we learn from our own continent? And that's what decolonization is.
And what's your take on that, Patrick?
When Xi the president of China, goes to the UN, he always speaks Chinese. And other people translate. The Europeans, the Germans, they translate. Why can't we do the same things? Sometimes I see our own, in these important places, they speak in English. Why can't they speak in our local languages? Our politicians speak in our local languages. And these languages are translated by media.
But now you guys are not really giving me a full definition. So does it only narrow down to linguistics only? Because when you talk about decolonization, it's something that's vast and so complex and so complicated, if I may say. Because when you even look at our borders are colonial. I mean, we didn't create, these borders are not African. So what is decolonization? Because is it just merely the changing of institutional names or names of buildings within our higher education institutions of learning? What are the depths of decolonization?
I think that's not a question we can answer today and say definitively that this is the definition of what we mean by decolonization. But what our project is, we began to unravel, right, what the issues are. For example, when we say African and An-African, what does that mean? In this week, we brought in languages. Our hope is that towards the end of this course, every student will probably, having gone through the various topics and course, will be able to say, I think this is what decolonization is. But to say definitively today, I think would be crossing the bridge.
Yeah, and decolonizing, it is a continuous verb. It's something that is happening. It is a process.
Okay, so in closing, I'd like to know, because we don't have that much time on our side, I'd just like to know, what are the expected learning outcomes of African Insights? By the end of this module, what do you expect from the student to have learned?
All right, there is a whole series of topics that have been lined up, okay? And our expectations are that students will go in this different topics, read them, answer the questions, which are also on board, and at the end, they would have at least an insight into what we mean by being African and being an African.
Okay. So any closing words before I wrap up?
Yeah, so I think, just to add to that, I think the outcomes that learners should take with them at the end of this course, especially this week, because we are talking about languages and culture, is to sort of gain a sense of value, of self-value, to value your own culture and your own identity and what it means to you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it from African Insight for this evening. Do join us same time, same place next week. And yes, we are going to be joined in by another speaker from African Insights. And the conversations do not stop. They do carry on Twitter at UJFM, at Smurfzinto, hashtag the general public affair, hashtag African Insights. And you mentioned something about you guys having a blog. Where do the students check out the blog?
Yeah, the students can check it out on Blackboard. They will be registered for the course and they can check it out on Blackboard. Everything's there. And I think we will soon start a YouTube channel and a Facebook page, so we'll keep you posted.
I also know that the module is not limited to first years only. Any other students can join. If as a student, I'd like to register this course, can I?
For now, it's going to be limited to the first years, I think, just to introduce the first years to African ideas and concepts.
So I guess,
and we're hoping.
I guess the first years will automatically register to the module.
Yes,
automatically, they are by default part of the course.
Okay, but for now, good music, good vibes coming your way, and we're about to get into Classic Generation with Umbegazeli and Usbusisa, where we look at entrepreneurial insights. But for now,